Now that we've gone through blood pressure, blood flow, and resistance, we can start getting into the systemic blood pressure itself. How it's generated, what it is, and where it comes from. So first off, the actual arterial pressure is generated by the heart. The left ventricle is what will generate the systemic blood pressure. The right ventricle is what would generate the pressure in the pulmonary circuit. But that movement of blood flow, the pressure is only generated because you have resistance in the vessels. If the heart simply pumped out into a huge open space, you wouldn't have any pressure. It'd be zero pressure because there's no resistance. So it's the pumping of the heart ventricles and then the resistance of the vessels is pumped into that creates your actual blood pressure. So your systemic pressure is going to be the highest in the aorta because that's right after that left ventricle. It's just after the blood is pushed out. So therefore it's the highest point of pressure. It's then going to decline through the entire pathway until by the time you get back up to the right atrium, it's 0 millimeters of mercury. Now, the steepest drop is in the arterioles. So basically to illustrate that, let's say we're looking at 120 over 80 millimeters of mercury pressure. Comes out of the aorta, you're 120. As you flow through, those arterioles will end up dropping the pressure down to maybe 20, 25 millimeters of mercury before it gets in the capillary. So you've gone from 100 down to 20, let's say. Then the capillaries, you lose a little more. You leave it in the venules by 15. So while it took the heart to the capillaries was 120 to 20, so 100 millimeters of mercury, the venules back up to the heart are going to do this in 15 millimeters of mercury. That's why the venous return has some other special aiding features, like that large lumen, the valves, usually the muscular pumps, all to help get that blood back up to the heart. So if we're looking at it from a graph point of view, you can notice the top line here. This is the systolic pressure. While the bottom line here, that is the diastolic pressure. The red line between, you notice, is going to be your pulse pressure. As the heart pumps, the pulse pressure goes up the highest, and then it drops because the heart is not pumping. It'll keep going up with every beat. Every time the ventricle contracts and pumps blood out, the pressure goes up to max. The pressure then will drop down to the min, diastolic, just before the next wave of pressure comes from the heart. So it's this constant pulsate pressure in the vessels closer to the heart. But as you get further from the heart, notice over here, the arterioles, where the pressure really starts to drop. The pulsate aspect is also dissipating. It's gone completely by the time you've hit the capillaries. There's no pulsate pressure. You don't have that pulse. It's gone. It's just one steady flowing pressure in the capillaries and the venules and the veins. And you've noticed you've lost your pressure. You're down 20 milliliters of mercury, give or take, down those capillaries. So the entire return trip is a very low pressure return trip to the heart, going from 15 milliliters of mercury roughly down to about 0 by the time you get back into the right atrium. So it's a high pressure start, get rid of that pressure, don't damage the capillaries, and then low pressure after. So this arterial blood pressure is really reflecting two main things, elasticity and the volume of blood. Elasticity, because remember those elastic arteries, they're going to stretch. And then volume of blood, think of the stroke volume. How much blood is being pumped out of the heart into the vessel? The more blood you pump out, the more that vessel has to kind of stretch out or accommodate. So these two factors are helping together to build that arterial blood pressure. Now, I've already mentioned close to the heart is pulsate because you have that pulse of the heartbeat. But further away, arterioles, capillaries, venules, veins, it's one steady pressure. You don't have that pulse in the heart anymore. All right, systolic. We've already mentioned back in the heart, systolic was contraction. Same thing here. Systolic pressure is during ventricular contraction. So as long as the ventricle is contracting, you're pushing up to your peak systolic pressure. But then, once the ventricle starts to relax, we're now in diastolic pressure. That's the lowest level of atrial pressure. Because when the heart's not contracting, the aorta and the other elastic arteries are all coming back down to size. The pressure is dissipating down the line. That blood is moving and flowing down to the next set of arteries. As the blood leaves, with no blood replacing it, that pressure starts to drop. That's the diastolic pressure, the low pressure. So you're thinking about 120 over 80 is your blood pressure, 120 over 70, 110 over 70, whatever. In that case, systolic is the higher number, the top. Diastolic is the bottom. So that 120 over 80, systolic 120, diastolic 80 millimeters of mercury. The pulse pressure is the difference between the two. So in the case of 120 over 80, that pulse pressure is 40. You say, well, I'm 110 over 80. Pulse pressure is 30 millimeters of mercury. The mean arterial pressure, known as MAP. Mean arterial pressure is diastolic blood pressure plus 1/3 of your pulse pressure. Remember, pulse pressure is systolic minus diastolic pressure. It's basically the difference between the two. So if we're going to take, let's say, an example of 110 millimeters of mercury over 80 millimeters of mercury. So your blood pressure, 110 over 80. In that case, diastolic is the 80 plus the pulse pressure, 110 minus 80 is 30. So 30 over 3 gives you 80 plus 10. That means 90 millimeters of mercury is your mean arterial pressure. Now, it's important to make sure that your mean arterial pressure is high enough, because if your mean arterial pressure is too low, it can create and cause a problem called ischemia. Basically, ischemia is inadequate blood flow to your tissues. If that happens, you could have a problem with oxygen delivery, nutrient delivery, a whole lot of different problems. But now, as you get further and further away from your heart, both your pulse pressure and your mean arterial pressure are going to decline. Well, because think about it, as you get further away, the pressure drops, but also the pulse pressure dissipates. It goes down to basically nothing. You don't have a pulse pressure by the time you reach the arterioles. So this will continue to decrease further you get from the heart. So a little about how the mean arterial pressure is looking, as well as some other blood flow.